My name is Tom Schreiber, and I am a creative and a maker.
My name is Rory Earnshaw, and I'm a creative.
My name is Rob Keil, and I'm a creative.
All right, everybody, we are back. This is Creativity is the Cure. I am your host, Malcolm Moore, and today I've got three very fascinating friends of mine, Tom Schreiber, Rob Keil, and Rory Earnshaw. How are you doing today, guys?
Oh, we're doing great.
Good.
Very well, thank you.
Let's start out this way. How did you guys meet? How did all three of you originally meet each other?
Well, we just met 5 minutes ago, actually. Hey, where are you going? I'm going in to talk with Malcolm. Oh, me too. And
Well, in actuality, Rory and I met about 30 years ago, perhaps.
Yeah,
Let's just say it was decades ago.
decades.
Yeah.
When I was working at an advertising agency and a profession I'm still involved in. And we needed a photographer for a particular ad campaign that I was working on. And Rory was recommended by our account executive who had worked with Rory and said, "Oh, you should work with this guy, Rory. He's great. I've worked with him many times. Let's give him a call." So we did. And I worked with Rory and had a great time. And I've been working with Rory now for decades on countless shoots, both still and video. And we've become good friends and enjoy working together all the time.
Yeah, it's a great partnership.
And then Tom came into the picture later when I was working at Robert Half, the staffing company. I was out of the ad agency business for a while and went to the corporate side, and that's where I met Tom. And we were working on creative development of some strategy and ad campaigns together, and became fast friends and seemed to have a lot in common. And we became friends and got along great. And then eventually the three of us sort of got together. I had the idea that the three of us should all know each other. And that's how this trio formed, essentially.
And now we're all friends.
Yes.
we're like a little jazz band that likes to celebrate making things and people who make things.
A jazz trio. I think Tom is right.
Yeah.
Us as a jazz trio. We each have our area of specialty. We each contribute something that we feel is uniquely ours, and yet we're always trying to work towards a common creative goal of making something.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
That's true.
What is Maker Compass Studio?
Well, Maker Compass Studio is what the three of us do together. And it is video storytelling, and we make videos that creators, makers can put on their social media feeds and on their website, and they can have it in their, a lot of times they're going to do trade shows and, maker markets and things like that. And so we're excited about how they can have those videos right there as people are coming up to their booth to kind of explain and show the process of how those things that are on the table came to be, right? It's often there's a story there, and video is a great way to do that. So I guess in short, we make compelling videos that celebrate the making process, but I think it's also much more than that as well.
Yeah, I mean, what I kind of find interesting about it too is that the three of us are also makers, and all three of us just love making things and are fans of people who make things. For example, I love to see people fix old pinball machines. I love to see painters paint. I love to see people making models. I've always been a fan of making, but also in awe of talented people who make things. So by making these videos about makers, we are pursuing our own interests, but we're also giving credit to people that we personally admire as far as their skill sets and things that they can do that we can't do.
Right.
And yet at the same time, we get to do what we do, which is make things. So it's kind of makers appreciating and showcasing other makers, which we feel is a sweet spot for us and one that we feel is really worthwhile.
Do you think that storytelling is the most important element of what you guys are doing collectively?
I would say so, because storytelling is an essential part of the human experience. And you can think of storytelling as, once upon a time, let me tell you a story, but storytelling happens in smaller, subtler moments as well. And so I think just the experience of connecting with, bringing your curiosity to the world of how did something come to be is inherently in the language of storytelling. Curiosity is the language of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be completely honest. Tom, I've known you the longest, and all three of you, not that long at all. However, we've had all these deep discussions, and it wasn't until a few days ago that I was embarrassed to say, what is a maker? There is a strong focus on using and learning practical skills and applying them to reference designs. There's also a growing work on equity and the maker culture. Maker culture emphasizes learning through doing, active learning, in a social environment. Maker culture emphasizes informal, networked, peer-led, and shared learning motivated by fun and self-fulfillment. In reaction to the rise of maker culture, President Barack Obama pledged to open several national research and development facilities to the public. In addition to the U.S., federal government renamed one of their national centers America Makes. It was a White House maker event. Please tell me your reaction to the whole quote.
It's one of great excitement. I mean, I think we share, certainly you as a teacher, Malcolm, and particularly a music teacher, the value that can come from, and I have a little experience as a teacher. I mean, I think we all do as parents.
Right.
Part of that job is to be teacher, to be a guide. And the experience of looking at the learning process and the teaching process as almost interchangeable. I think that's so much a part of this maker idea, is that you don't have to be the expert in something. What you need is to have curiosity.
Right.
Yeah.
And you need to be comfortable with failing and discovering along the way.
Does the curiosity lead to the storytelling?
Yes, I think absolutely. The curiosity, the reason why I think we make these little videos is because we're curious about what people are doing. We all three of us love to find out, how are bicycle machine parts made, right? You see them in the store or on the website or whatever. You don't give it any thought about how they're made. Well, we have an excuse by making these films to go out and see how all kinds of things are done. How food is made, hopefully how molten metal is poured. I've always wondered how Rodin did what he did. I think on one of our upcoming projects, we're going to have a chance on a smaller scale to learn those tricks and techniques. And I think that's just a fantastic thing. That's our language, right?
Yeah.
It's curiosity.
Curiosity.
Like one of the things that I've learned in meeting several of my heroes in life has been stay curious, be curious.
Yeah.
And if you are curious, you never stop learning. And there is no end of things that you can learn if you stay curious. This is a way, at least for me, that I get to learn a little bit about a lot of different stuff and, have fun while doing it. And I'm able to sort of put people up on a pedestal whose work may not be recognized or understood properly until presented in the most beautiful way.
Yeah. And I think, as you say, stay curious, but for us, that's not hard. I mean, that's our default.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it works so beautifully, because we're not working at being fascinated by things. We are fascinated by things that maybe not everybody wants to really delve into, but those people who do, they really get it.
Yeah.
They get what we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing I think about is when I got from New York, and I know we talked about that stuff. I was your guest on a previous episode.
Right.
When I got to California, I was stretched thin. I came out here. My wife's family was out here, and I had a hope of extending the business that I was doing in New York, and online advertising sponsorship network, and making that work in California. And short story is, it didn't. I moved into an internet dead zone in the center of Silicon Valley, and I found myself with my, not yet year-old baby son in the Bjorn, going around and knocking on doors, like Thomas the Tank Engine. How am I going to be useful in this place? And a number of people took me under their wing.
Wow.
And in the course of it, I started to make a little sort of video, just really scrappy with my iPhone.
Yeah.
We're doing an event, Earth Day, and I started to use that as a kind of snowball as I was applying to different jobs. How can I bring that into it? And how does that change? How does having this artifact give me a kind of reason to do something in a way? The short story is that little video, that movie, that tweet-umentary took the form of an interview with a children's book author and a publisher. And we were doing a reading event in Los Altos at a local bookstore. But as a standalone video, that became the thing that gave me the edge and helped me to get the job at Robert Half.
Wow.
So it took a lot to kind of get that. I think we were put in a room and literally told, your job is to reach for the stars. It was an internal program called Reach for the Stars, about recognizing high-performing employees. And we just started to talk about the power of myth and mentors. And I think we got out of there and went up to a restaurant.
Yeah.
Just to, and so the whole idea that this was work and this was play, it just evaporated. We were doing stuff.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention, just in response, sorry to backtrack a bit, is when we're talking about makers and the maker movement, I just wanted to mention just a little more context in terms of what that maker movement means.
Yeah.
There was a magazine called Make Magazine around 2006, 2007, I believe.
Yeah.
Oh,
that
wow.
actually considered the beginning of the maker movement. And it was kind of a rebellion against the assumption of mass-produced, quickly thrown away stuff, consumerism, that people would just buy stuff, use it for 2 years, and throw it out. Mm-hmm. The idea behind Make Magazine was to rekindle, specifically in the American culture, but obviously worldwide, the idea that making things yourself is empowering and worthwhile and shareable and sustainable and exciting. And as a result, beginning around 2006, 2007, the maker movement came out of that magazine. And soon there were maker fairs. And now every year there's a maker fair. And now there are dozens of maker fairs all over the country.
And school maker fairs.
Yeah. And maker spaces at various civic locations like libraries, high schools.
I hear that, is this true? They're called not only maker spaces, but hacker spaces and fab labs.
Fab labs. My children's school had a fab lab, and it's really quite wonderful, right? And it's closely connected on some level with what the advent of the personal computer brought to the creative space for people.
Yes.
Steve Jobs famously called the personal computer a bicycle for the mind. You can go much further through we're having a conversation now on a personal computer. Yeah. Or that is a podcast.
Or his original idea was called a Wonderbox, and I think that's how I'm talking to you, the iPhone.
MacBook Pro.
Yeah.
Another thing was the advent of the 3D printer.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I read that that's a
Other,
big component of the
consumer level
maker.
products that also came in that time period. People starting to be able to burn wood in special, little laser cutters,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
I mean, that whole thing arose, and it's just continued to gain momentum. And personally, I think the COVID crisis enabled that even further.
Even
because
accelerated.
people,
Yeah.
one, they couldn't go out and buy things, and two, they had a lot of time on their hands, and they started to reevaluate what's really important.
And making
What
bread
really
too,
want-
right?
Yeah.
I remember a lot of that.
Yeah, and in some cases there was an economic necessity. I know a number of people whose personal maker business began during the onset of the pandemic. They're just doing what it was that they could do, whether it was baking goods and taking them door to door, selling them to neighbors, giving them to neighbors. They started to acquire a reputation. Things grow and snowball. And I've talked to a number of people in the maker community about the impact of COVID. Certainly, out of tragedy, there's always some growth.
Yeah, I think COVID gave people a lot of time off. And in that time off, what are you going to do? You're going to cook, you're going to nest, you're going to do the things that you're passionate about that before that you never had time necessarily to work on.
I think COVID again was, perhaps the next major chapter in the maker movement.
Right.
It continued to gain momentum, and now that we're in a quote post-COVID world, a lot of people have reevaluated their careers, what's important to them, and they've gotten in touch with what they really find as their calling. And I think many people have found a calling that is outside the sort of 9-to-5 office job that they had previously.
That poses the question, if it weren't for COVID, do you think we would be doing this?
Well, it is a very good question. I think that a large part of what Rob and I worked on at Robert Half was essentially helping people with this idea of predicting the future, which is only to say saying something about the future before the future got there. We would interview experts and pull together reports and white papers and things. So we had on our radar cloud computing and remote work and all those kinds of things that were only accelerated by the pandemic. The pandemic sort of took a lot of those, future of work initiatives and hypercharged them. All of a sudden, within the first week of the pandemic, I think a lot of schools shifted to remote learning. Businesses made the switch, and so there a lot of that. It was in the works that we would get to a place of it. We just got there faster in a way because of the pandemic and necessity.
I'm thinking more in terms of Maker Compass Studio.
Yeah.
Would we have had the free time to come up with this idea? I think we would be doing this because we're doing what we're passionate about.
But we might not have thought of it. We might not have thought of it as a project,
Yeah.
And maybe it just sort of crystallized the idea of an ongoing project.
Yeah.
Because we had that break.
And we were able to think outside of the little box that we were all in at the time.
Yeah.
I guess.
I think the quote comes to mind here: necessity is the mother of invention. And it's Mother's Day. Because, right, it's always Mother's Day in that regard, because things don't always go as planned, and you got to improvise. The cool thing about that, though, and I know I can see your smile, Malcolm, because this brings us right into the jazz conversation. Yeah. You make a mistake and you do it again, and now you have a riff.
Yeah.
You have a riff.
Or as Miles Davis says, if you hit a wrong note, the more important thing is the note you follow that note with.
Well, yes.
To make it right.
That's the opportunity.
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to ask you guys, I had a guest on my podcast earlier named Jeff Leon, and he works for a company. He's a chemist, and they've developed this biodegradable utensils and dishware and all things like that. They are obviously having some challenges now because of the new administration and tariffs and bringing things in they need. So here are these guys trying to help heal the earth. And when I did research on the makers, it said one aspect of it was a healthy backlash to people not taking care of the planet. So how important is that aspect to what you guys do and the maker community in general?
Well, I would say right off the bat that makers tend to, by necessity, use materials that are available to them,
right?
Typically locally.
Yeah.
And they reuse materials a lot.
That's
They
wonderful.
don't think of anything as complete garbage. They're like, okay, I have these components. What can I rig this up to be? Or I have this thing that currently has zero value. How can I reuse it as part of something else?
Yeah,
That's
taking things
first
apart.
Yeah, taking things apart and reusing them for other purposes.
Deconstructing, reconstructing.
Yeah, whether that's a functional piece or an art piece. Sometimes it's strictly visual, but the idea of conservation is actually well built into the maker culture of reusing material.
I think this guy is very practical. For your listeners, I'm holding up what we would describe as a replica of Wall-E from the Pixar movies.
Yeah, beautiful movie. Love it. And great message that has to do with what we're talking about.
Yeah, this was in Rob's office when I first brought my young children to work at Robert Half, and
yeah,
I have a photo of my youngest son holding this up and exclaiming with delight. But Wall-E's message is that it's going through the discarded material, in fact, the whole planet, and finding new ways to think about old things.
I think when I think of maker-made stuff that's for sale, I immediately think of the farmer's market.
Yeah.
I don't see the big, can we say Amazon? I don't know. I don't see people purchasing beautiful handmade maker stuff, having it delivered from Amazon. Yeah. Maybe Etsy at a push, but if I'm looking for something really special, I want to see it. I want to hold it. I want to feel it. I want to meet the person who made it.
Yeah.
Really get a feel for what it is and who made it, and then purchase it. So when it comes to the actual buying part, I think, what could be better for the environment than getting it at the farmer's market or in a local shop?
Yeah.
In a small shop.
And makers in those scenarios, in farmers markets, maker markets, the little maker fairs, pop-ups, you name it. There's every mode of this. In some ways, it's a big part of what we're doing because they have significant challenges, logistics, where are they going to set up, unloading their vehicles and such.
Paying for the space, right?
Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a really tough one when you're trying to make a profit.
Right. I mean, a retail establishment, too, is another place where we think that these videos can live. And retail space is very much at a premium. Especially now. It's like, retail space is very expensive. What do you do with that retail space to make it pay off? And if you can have a demonstration of how your product is beautifully crafted one at a time, and you can show the value and the effort and the handwork that goes into that product right there in your store. That imbues that object on the table with a whole story that is invisible if that story is not there in the retail environment.
If it's not told, a very special story it is too.
Yeah.
And in a situation where you're lucky enough as, someone strolling through one of these markets, whether large or small, to have a one-on-one conversation with perhaps the person that made those things, right? Not just there at the in a purely transactional sense, we come to the aid of their sharing their story. And that's what we try to do with the people that we work with, is to think about, well, what is your story to tell? And then how can we make a video that allows you a reference point to the kinds of things you want your audience, your customers to know about, right? So that you can just gesture to the monitor at that time and say, oh, this is where we, pick the strawberries, or this is where we're pouring the molten metal, whatever it is, right? That's the amazing thing about this, is that people making things can make things in all sorts of ways and with all kinds of different materials. And, I think about what Rory says in that curiosity thing, is that it gives you a front row
seat to life. Yeah. You get to see things that normally other people might not get to see. Yeah.
Well, it makes me think of the Tanzanian food restaurant project. Swahili Spot.
Yeah.
If you were to just walk into Swahili Spot and sit down, you would have no idea that there's this wonderful, energetic woman who learned how to make these recipes from her mother back in Tanzania as a child, learned how to wield a knife, how to mix ingredients, how to mix spices, how to put them together in exactly the right amount, how to present it, how that is an expression of her culture. And then it lands on your table and you get to eat it. Like, if you just walk in and there's a plate of food, okay, that's one thing.
Right.
But by allowing her to tell her story, there is a whole universe of background and appreciation that you've created around that meal that would be impossible to tell any other way.
Even the words on the wall.
Yeah. The Swahili writings on the wall. So you go in and you're immediately transported into curiosity mode, because there's all these Swahili words on the wall and you want to know what they all mean. And then there's a row of flags, and there's must be 30 different flags there. And then you go, wait a minute, Africa's a huge continent with dozens of countries. I wonder what this flag is and that flag. So your curiosity is piqued before you've even tasted the food.
Yeah, and music is a big part of the Maker Faire.
Tell me more about that.
Well, when we first arrived, I think it was 2011, 2012, the first one I went to with my then very young boys. We were met at the parking lot by an R2D2 and then another R2D2. And from this point on, we're just making our way into this sea of activity. And now there are taiko drums and rhythms, and the R2D2s are spinning around, and dragons are shooting flames out.
Wait, where was this?
Oh, this is at right where the San Mateo Bridge is. There's a fairground, and that's where Maker Faire had been in the Bay Area for quite some time.
The San Mateo Fairgrounds?
The fairgrounds, yeah. And it was fantastic. There was a musical performance with Tesla coils conducting charges through history.
Yeah, we're lucky that, a lot of the maker movement actually is centered in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Cool. We need to be very close to all of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think many of the first, if not the first, Maker Faires were here in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
And a lot of the innovative companies that have grown out of that are here in the Bay Area. So we're lucky to be part of it.
Well, it's kind of a funny thing, when we were at Robert Half, and we were challenged, particularly Rob and I, to help uncover the value of the Robert Half Technology brand and brand story. I mean, it was literally the project that we were put on. We would go out to Onkar's innovation table. It was a Wendy's. It was a Wendy's. We would go there for lunch. I would bring my lunch in a Tupperware, and what would you get food?
I'd get their Wendy's chili, which is really
the chili, and on occasion I would get
finger food. I think they called that for a while.
We'd be driving back on 280, right? And you recognize that directly across the street from Robert Half, which was on Sand Hill Road at the time, where we worked, was the Stanford Linear Accelerator. It was also the site of the Homebrew Computer Club. there was so much Silicon Valley history there. And I think what we tried to do, and successfully, was to allow the organization to embrace that we're here in the center of Silicon Valley, and we can really lean into this garage culture, this, let's get together like a jazz band, and you can code, you can design, and let's see what we're going to come up with. And right, of
And that's
course,
still true. I mean, a lot of the people that I think we work with now or want to work with now are people who literally have started businesses in their garages.
Let's not forget Mark Maron. He ended up getting Obama in his garage because it all
Yeah.
started in the
Yeah.
garage.
One of my all-time favorite clients was Klutz Publishing, and they did these wonderful books for children, and they were sort of, I would call them maker books. They would be instructional and quirky and really fun for kids to read. And then there would, with the book, there would be a bag of ingredients, and it would be, seeds for your garden, or how to make hair bands, how to make natural face compresses for young people and stuff like that. That all started out from a garage. The Cassidy, who started it, he started making hacky sacks in his garage, and he was selling them out of the trunk of his car, and they weren't selling. So then he decided to put a book with it of how to use hacky sacks and how to play with them.
right.
And all of a sudden that took off.
Wow.
From that little thing in his garage. Now they're owned by, I think, Scholastic. So they moved to New York. They got bought by a corporation, and their books are everywhere, and they're huge. And that just started out in a one-car garage in Palo Alto.
Yeah.
That's a maker success
Fantastic.
story.
Yeah. Or,
That went a little too far because now it's a corporate success story.
Yeah.
Is the garage where all these things happen connected at all to what they call the man cave or the she shack?
Maybe the person cave, I would say. I grabbed a book off the shelf as I was, coming up here, uncovering the myths of innovation. I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be a garage, right? It can be. In fact, a lot of the work at Apple was done in one of Steve Jobs' parents' bedrooms. There's a mythology about it, and myths are, symbols help to tell stories. But your podcast is called "We're On Creativity is the Cure," right?
Yeah,
And so a lot
right.
of your listeners, those listening right now, are creatives. They're making things, and they're thinking about, I think, how do you make something that shows up as something in someone's life is an important part of it, right? There's the making of the thing, which you do for its own intrinsic worth and the joy. And then I think when you're making something that can be useful to others or help them to help meet some challenge that arises,
Right.
is that's where I think things can really do take off.
Well, and I think you could tie that into music. If you think of garage band music, right?
Yeah.
You have the very most basic stuff, and people like to make fun of garage bands, right? But without garage bands, you wouldn't have had the Ramones. Without
Yes.
the Ramones, I would argue you possibly wouldn't have the Sex Pistols. But the Sex Pistols, for better or worse, changed the culture of the United Kingdom, right? And that came out of a garage.
Yeah.
They couldn't necessarily play their instruments very well. I don't know. I'm not a musician.
No, this is true. I just taught my students about the punk movement. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
There's maybe we put it in the notes, but there's a maker talk on the punk origins of the maker movement. I mean, it's really diving deep into this whole notion of, just DIY, do it yourself, lay a track down. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's authentic. The funny thing is, we all come from, and, I think through necessity, coming through art school and whatever, did a lot of work and continue to in the mainstream world, in the corporate world, and making highly polished things
Right.
and all of that. We're able to bring that same skill set to this reality where
Yeah.
people are making things overnight.
I think that's really, I was going to try to make that same point, and that is that, each of us has a specialty. For example, Rory has been a photographer for decades and has been shooting just about anything you can imagine for decades and has exhibited at some pretty prestigious shows and has been recognized with awards.
Right.
Tom has worked on some very major brands at some very major ad agencies. I've been director in a number of large and small ad agencies and done my thing. I've been editing video for a very long time now, doing both short form television commercials as well as documentaries. We each bring our own perspective and our own skill set to it, but we're used to working at a truly professional level. Each of us has decades of experience in our specific skill area. And one of the reasons that we are, I think, successful and excited about what we're doing is that we're bringing that level of professionalism to smaller makers that don't necessarily have the budget to spend $100,000 to hire an advertising agency and a production company and a sound recording company and a producer and all these things that you would normally have to do to produce something of broadcast or cinema quality. We're able to bring our collective experience at that professional level.
It levels the playing field.
Yeah, to people who would not normally have access to that level of production. Tom, for example, has worked on strategy for major brands that he now can apply to a mom and pop brand if that's what is needed at that moment.
Right.
Rory has shot for major corporations that have very expensive products that are in department stores, but he can now shoot videos and stills of things that end up in some place as mundane as a maker fair on a weekend, if that's what is called for. So being able to bring those world-class client experiences to a regular audience of makers deserve to have their stuff presented as
the general population.
Yeah, I think that's something that we do that we're passionate about, and we're happy to be able to bring that to the table.
To me, you're like a killer trio band. You make me think of the Police because they were undercover as a punk band, but if you really know about them, Sting was a teacher. Andy was already a prestigious jazz player, and then you've got Stuart, who grew up traveling the world because his dad was in the CIA. So Stuart was learning all these Middle Eastern rhythms, things like that.
For me, I'm very excited by the fact that we've all been doing this for so long. And as I was driving over here today, I thought, this is why we've been doing what we've been doing for so long. For me, this is the purpose of it. Everything that I've done in the last 30 years photographing for clients, which has been wonderful, but I've been learning all along the way. I know Rob, I know Tom have been doing the same thing. And we've got to a point where that's going to be really useful for something that we're really passionate about. And I think that's a very exciting place to be.
Well, what's interesting about that is it brings to mind the present, the gift of the present, which ironically is the subject matter of that tweetumentary, which, first introduced me to Rob. If the present is always where you are and you value what you have around you and the opportunities you have to serve others, that present continues to renew itself. So, what I was doing 10 years ago was the present then. Mm-hmm. This is the present now.
Yeah, well, I would say, for example, I am still in the advertising agency business, and I love the advertising agency business. That's my passion. I have always wanted to work in the advertising agency business, and I have, and I've been very lucky to do that. And to now at the same time be able to say, hey, okay, I love doing that, but I can also apply these skills to an audience that I wasn't expecting to be able to serve. Much in this case, I could help out this guy
It's a
Yeah.
beautiful
by
thing.
leveraging my experience working on national brands. Okay, yeah, I've worked on Wells Fargo Bank and I've worked on grocery stores and home builders and all these other big corporations.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I could help a jeweler who makes custom jewelry just by applying what I've learned on those major brands, but focusing that effort on someone whose product is smaller and more personal.
Yeah.
And I love all of it. I love
Yeah.
doing all of it.
A big part of the what animates the maker movement in this larger sense is the openness to collaborate and to be in service of the main act, which is our experience on this earth, and getting to make things that are beautiful and useful, and to do that together.
As you know, social media is wonderful because now anybody can get their stuff out there. That wasn't always the case, at least when I was growing up. But one of the challenges is that social media is oversaturated. So I know so many talented people that are on social media and they can't get enough followers, and I know they feel like giving up. What would you bring to the table if you found a maker who impressed you and you wanted to help them rise to another level? Because there's so many people out there that are great writers, artists, musicians that are just not being heard. What would be your approach to help someone like that?
I think that is definitely a Tom question.
Me too. I mean,
Yeah.
This is, I think, Tom's specialty,
Yeah.
which is the figure out what's that key differentiator, what's that key insight.
At least
Well,
maybe help them be a better storyteller by your perspective, right?
Yeah. Well, we created an email address just for that purpose. It's mystory@makercompassstudio.com.
Right.
And it's about the curiosity that we can have as we learn more about who that artist is and who that maker is, what they're making, why they're making, what challenges have they run into, right? These are conversations that we want to have.
And what is it? Part of it also what makes them stand out? Can you help them do that?
Yeah, absolutely. But it comes from that immersion, spending the time really listening, taking a lot of notes, thinking, playing with ideas. What are some approaches that have worked for others that might apply? I try to think about one of my favorite authors and innovators, Rosabeth Moss-Kanner, has this notion of kaleidoscopic thinking. And what that really means is you look at the world where the fragments of the past are rearranged through the kaleidoscopic view, and you begin to see new patterns fall into place, and you keep turning it, and you start to see something emerge as you move different things around and play with different combinations. There's no one size fits all, I think, of what's going to make somebody beat the algorithms or stand out. I think it's about uncovering what drove them to begin this process of creativity in the first place, And I think, as Rob mentioned earlier, our Swahili spot video with Priscilla, her story of learning to cook from her mother is beautiful.
Yeah.
I was looking at her directly in the eye as she was sharing that story. It was a gift.
And I don't think you necessarily have to get these people, these makers, out to the whole world. I think you almost need to help them find like-minded people. Would that be?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Would that be a component?
Absolutely. I mean, it is not, I think every day, what Rob was saying earlier about the 20th century mass culture and, three networks and
Yeah.
the one major brand on the shelf. Things are much more diversified now. It's the long tail, and it's finding that there is an abundance of opportunity and ways to make connections, ways to show up and be in service of something, larger than yourself, and something that's going to help people and help make that part of the world a little bit better.
It's not
Yeah.
better or worse. It's just different, right?
Yeah,
Different,
I think part of them, I mean, I've seen the advertising business evolve a lot in the time I've been in it. And I think one of the greatest advances we've made, I'm not an enemy of progress in the advertising business. In fact, I love it. One of the things that I think is the most exciting development of all is that we are no longer limited to television, magazine, newspaper, radio. Right? Now you can get very specific about interests. Now you can target people specifically with podcasts, with Facebook groups, with Instagram groups, with all of these different very specific and measurable media that you could never do before.
Right.
And to me, the fact that you can focus so clearly in on your people, you can find your tribe in a way now with your communication that was completely impossible in the world dominated strictly by print and broadcast.
One of the things that is really of interest, and hopefully Rob can share more of the story, is that he's lived that. He had a lifelong love of automobile advertising, and I think maybe you could talk about how you grew that project through social media and groups and finding enthusiasts.
Yeah, I'll try to make it a quick story, but when I was a kid, I just loved going through old magazines, and I just loved advertising. My dad had a huge collection of magazines that he'd collected over the years.
Must have been some really cool stuff. I can't imagine.
Yeah, stuff going all the way back to the 40s and 50s through the 60s. And I would just pour through these magazines. I didn't care about the articles, but I looked through the ads. And I would see ads for TWA Airlines, illustrated, beautiful illustrations. I would see photographs by world-class photographers of destinations. I would see cars illustrated by the top illustrators in the world. I would see beautiful product shots of, sodas and alcohol and food products, just artfully, beautifully photographed and presented. And the way the copy is written is so smart and so well targeted and has such great attitude. I just fell in love with advertising when I was about 10 years old.
That's incredible.
And I was very lucky in that in my first day of college, I took a class called Advertising Layout.
There you go.
And I thought, I might be interested in this. And literally from the first hour of my first class on my first day of college, I knew I wanted to be an art director in advertising. And one of my heroes was a guy named Art Fitzpatrick, who was the preeminent illustrator of cars in the 1950s and 60s for General Motors.
Oh, man.
Eventually, after I became an art director and had been in the business a few years, the internet was around, and I said, I'm going to look this guy up. I became friends with him, and we corresponded for a while. I spent time with him at his house down in Carlsbad.
Amazing.
And we decided together that I would write a book about him and showcasing his work in the car illustration business and how that evolved in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s.
And you did that?
And I wrote the book, and
I got to read
the
it.
artwork. I did the research, and I got to know him and his family and his partner's family, who did the backgrounds. I got to have firsthand knowledge and a friendship with one of my childhood heroes who inspired me to get into advertising in the first place. It was a tremendous privilege.
What an opportunity.
A life-changing thing to do. And at the end of it, I had this book that I felt really proud of because it was a tribute to my hero.
Yeah.
And it was also a documentation of a type of artwork, a period of time in advertising, and an artistic process that is no longer in fashion, but it cemented my love of advertising from the time I was a kid. And perhaps that's one of the reasons I still love the advertising business after all this time. And that book, of course, is one of the things that I got to make. So I too am a maker of things, and that book was one of them.
And if I may, it's a stunningly beautiful book that shows Rob's passion as much as the passion of the people that the book is about. I mean, it's just an exquisitely done book to the taste level that Rob just brings to everything.
I remember
and
seeing
Rob's a very special maker himself.
Early drafts of it as it was coming together, and I think you went up to Tahoe, and he would send me things to look at and just kind of riff on, and it was such a incredible process, because he had certain anchors. This is down, this is down, this is down. And then he would write to the amount of space he had in the layout. So it was all driven by the visual impression of what it's like Armando. When Armando talks about, I know what I like, he is already thinking about the Genesis fan holding that book in their hands.
Yeah.
And that he gets to give them a gift each and every time, And,
especially back then when there was no internet. For me, when I bought that book, I was just like, whoa,
Yeah.
I think with Rob's work on that book, there was no compromise whatsoever. How many rounds of proofs were there?
I did something like 5 or 6 rounds of color proofs. I wanted every single image in that book, I wanted to represent the original artwork. And I went around the country.
Yeah.
What year was this?
This was about 5 years ago.
Oh, okay. So recent. Okay.
Yeah,
very recent.
Yeah, and many of those pieces of artwork had been seen in other books, scanned out of magazines, kind of poorly scanned out of magazines, and kind of cobbled into other collections. But I actually, as much as I could, I sought out the original artwork, which is extremely, extremely rare and in the hands of very few collectors in the world. And I traveled around the country and consulted with Rory on photographing what's the best way to actually photograph and color calibrate every single image to represent the color and the sharpness of every image accurately. And then I would go back to those reference shots and the color calibration and make proof after proof after proof to make sure that that image in the book represents exactly what the original art looks like. And no one had ever really done that before. Certainly, I admired that other people had wanted to show that work in their books and collected it in some rough form or another, along with many other pieces. But no one had really ever done an Art Fitzpatrick and Van Kaufman book. I was just obsessed with present this as accurately as possible and in ways that it has never been seen before. One of the things that was nice is that back in the old days, we had terrific optical equipment to do that kind of work, to reproduce art.
Right.
But now, not only do we have that, but we have digital calibration. And I could show artwork in my book in a better condition than you could show it back in the 50s and 60s. So I would say, in some ways, what's in my book is actually better than any previous reproduction of the original art. And even that, the original art, if you look at it, is just jaw-droppingly beautiful and crafted. But it was, to me, a privilege to be able to present to a current audience the absolute craftsmanship of that artwork that had never really been seen to that level of perfection before. Those guys are just my heroes. And I was so lucky to be able to do that project.
That carries across to Maker Compass, in that we've all agreed amongst us that every frame of any video that we do has to look as good as it possibly can.
Right.
And serve the client as best as it possibly can.
Yeah.
I did a little filming at Swahili Spot on my own that was not quite up to par. And I heard right away, this is not going to cut it. We're going to have to redo that. We can make it a lot more beautiful than that. Every frame of this is not a compelling frame. And we went back and we redid the whole thing.
Wow.
Out of if we want to say that.
Well,
we did.
Well, I guess we did.
That was due to circumstances well beyond your control.
Right, but it does speak to the fact that
But yeah,
reality, we're serious about everything looking as good as it possibly can.
there is not one shot in any of the videos that we've produced that I would not say that's a beautiful shot. Every single shot has got to be a beautiful shot.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the fact is, anybody can shoot a video nowadays, but to us, we're not in that just show the thing, right? We are into make every shot of this thing showcase the beauty of the thing that is being made. Yeah. And it's a requirement. Mm-hmm. It's not a preference. It is like, we're either going to do this or we're just not going to do it. Every shot has to be absolutely beautiful. Mm-hmm. And
I know what you guys are talking about because I've seen your demo reel, and this is absolutely true.
And it speaks, for me, I got to say, a lot of that comes from working with Rob for so long. I mean, I have my own visual style, but I know that Rob doesn't settle for anything that's not 100% perfect. And I'm really grateful for that because it's made me a better filmmaker. And particularly having Rob edit my films, it's just made me a better filmmaker.
Thanks. Well, I've, certain things that I've noticed that Rory does, I think, and over time has developed that I appreciate are the ability to selectively show only what is necessary, because a lot of times you're shooting in environments that are very busy, they're badly lit, there's a lot of noise. Rory has the ability to focus in specifically on that beautiful little thing that is the center of the story.
I think that's true, but I think also we have developed that together as we've worked together on films for 15 years now.
As a style, I guess as a style.
Your art direction has brought a lot to the way that I create images.
You can see Rory's other work. It's compositionally beautiful. It's geometrically interesting. His sense of light and dark, of focus, all of those artistic things that you want photography to be, he does all that. And similarly, I would say to Tom brings a strategic understanding of marketing problems to every project. He brings an enthusiasm. He's very enthusiastic about solving marketing problems, about getting to know the client, determining what their best, smartest messaging is, and how to express that as a story. So, from the beginning, the roadmap is clear. We have the roadmap figured out. Rory shoots the heck out of it, makes it look fantastic. I finish it to be as polished and beautiful as it can possibly be. And then we hand that over to our client, and they have all this ammo, if you will, to be able to promote their products and services and use them in all these different situations, which, we're giving them a toolkit for success, basically. That's how I see it.
I wanted to go back to when you guys were saying that a lot of the things you film, it's difficult because the lighting's not good and it's very busy. But how do you achieve that while also being true to the real environment so the person watching feels like they're still there and it's accurate and true?
Well, that's a good question. It just kind of happens naturally. Most of the places that we film in, they're huge and they're busy, but the overall wide shot can be really beautiful because there's a structure to the building or there's a color scheme going on. There's always something that you can find in that wide frame that gives you a context for where this is filmed. Right. And then once you've delivered that context, which Rob will often put right up at the front of the opening scene, then you can get as close in on the most beautiful things that you want, the things that have interesting shapes, movements, colors, and then of course just the people that you're dealing with. The people will make you feel where you are. When you look at Mark Nordstadt on the Paragon Machine Works, the background is soft, out of focus, and quite dark, but you're just in love with Mark. because he's such an enthusiastic, compelling person to look at.
Yeah.
So he's got you emotionally, even if we photographed him on a white seamless, he would be compelling.
Yeah.
But having that out of focus shot and the movements going on there.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what Rory is talking about is actually, and he may not take credit for this, but it's actually photographic aesthetics. For example, having the background be very out of focus, you can get a sense of the space, of what it's like, its tone, its feeling, its busyness. But if it's out of focus or it's lit in a certain way, like Rory will tend to have the lighting of the background recede and be much darker than the foreground. You get a sense of where it is, you get a sense of the type of industrial space that it is in this case with Mark, but you are not lit in on every little detail of, the screws and the dirt and the ink on the page.
Yeah.
You get a sense of where it is, but it's visually presented in a way that focuses your attention on the real subject, which is Mark and his story.
Yeah.
So I think it's how you shoot it.
And then you can get the close-ups of the ink and the screws and the whatever, the flour on the table or whatever. And then that's where Rob brings in his beautiful editing and has such a natural flow of bouncing from the person to the close-up to the wide shot. I think of our video. We made a video of Rozit singing a song in a train station.
Right.
And we had 3 cameras on that. And I think every angle was very compelling and very beautiful. And the song, of course, is very beautiful. So I thought it was going to be good.
Tom, is that the one you sent me yesterday?
It is, yes.
That's beautiful. And it's amazing now that I know where you filmed it. I thought it looks like it's filmed in the Middle East. It's so beautiful. The beige and the shadows.
Yeah.
But I think a whole lot of that was in the edit. The opening with the wide scene and then the close up and the slight movements that Rob did and the color corrections and everything. It's great when you have really beautiful footage and you're happy with that. And then I turn it over to Rob and I go, oh, this is only going to get much better.
But know what's funny about that video is, to me, it's also stark and raw. And that aspect made it impossible for me to stop watching. It was almost like the woman was right in front of me. It didn't look like there was any, special effects or things to make it look better. I didn't even notice the lighting. It was just beautiful and real.
Yeah, this song is stark and raw, and it's such a strong, beautiful song that you have to watch it just to hear the song resolve.
You have to.
What I saw in that immediately when I saw the footage was, and when we talked about this, vulnerability.
Vulnerability.
Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When you first see her, she's in this giant place and she's this little figure that walks in. And she's very vulnerable.
And she is a tiny, vulnerable person.
Right?
Yeah.
And then as the song progresses, we cut to the closer to her. And then we cut even closer to her. And then the camera starts to move a little bit, very subtly. And it creates this sort of intimacy with the character as time goes on.
Yeah.
And then by the time her song is finished, you feel like you've been doing almost this close dance with her.
Yeah.
And she walks off into the distance.
Yeah.
So it's using the language of scale and of sequence to make you connect with a character in a way that's emotionally drawing you in to her art,
And the interesting thing about how that relates to authenticity, a number of artists have talked about this idea that art is a lie that tells the truth. Both Picasso and Degas talked about that theme. There's a certain perspective that a finished work of any kind can give the viewer, and it's as Bob Rauschenberg used to say, art can be an invitation to wake up and appreciate the world as it is, right? So as an artist, you go through all these sort of techniques and try this and there's a considerable craft. The end result though is that the person feels as if they're experiencing oftentimes a very intimate and quiet moment, and I think that comes through in that work in particular.
And I think that's absolute authenticity, because we had about 7 people in the room at that point. None of them were on the crew. They were all doing something.
Right.
They were doing a different photo shoot in the corner. They rented the space. That's how we paid for it. I subleased the place. So the other people in the room had no idea what was about to happen. And we did this in one take. I had 3 cameras set up. Rozit walked out, sang the song, and walked away. And everybody, their jaws just hit the floor. It was such a beautiful, intimate moment that nobody was expecting. And that people were left sort of in shock. I was in shock. I knew the song, and I knew the space, and I knew it was going to be beautiful, but her performance left me very emotional.
I remember this because I saw the camera was still running when she finished. And you came over and hugged her, and she hugged you. It was like you guys had been through an experience going through this.
And that wasn't scripted.
No.
I didn't even know that was on.
That wasn't even on the. You probably didn't even know the camera was still running.
No.
But the fact is, her presentation of her personal story coming to San Francisco was so vulnerable and so touching and so emotionally genuine that how can you not fall in love with that experience?
Yeah.
So I think it ties in with what Tom is saying. You are ultimately telling the truth. Right.
Absolutely.
And my point in making the edit was not to wow you with technique.
Yeah.
The point to make the edit is to ultimately tell the truth of what she was saying with her music. And I think we told her truth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we communicated on that. You showed me rough drafts. Just the very first rough draft blew me away, because it just was a very simple telling of the story. And then it just got technically better and better as we went along, or as you went along. Yeah, it was remarkable.
Yeah.
Remarkable piece of music.
Yeah.
And I'd say a pretty remarkable translation of that piece of music into visuals.
Yeah, you're just looking to
tell a great team.
You're just looking to tell the truth. You're just looking to tell a great story and tell the truth.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're doing. And you're doing it in the most artful way possible.
Yeah. I've got a question for you, Malcolm. Since I don't know what the episode number was, that it seems like a moment ago and a long time ago when I was on as your guest, I got feedback from old friends, family members. I never knew that about you, kind of thing. My sister.
Yeah.
And, my mom and dad. And so but the question for you is, since you've been on this project, the Creativity is the Cure mission, what's some of the feedback that you've gotten? Where has it awoken something in one of your listeners? And what's that been like for you?
Well, I have a few things to say. First of all, it introduced me to people like you, because I did the Armando one, and then you reached out to me. So I'm starting to meet a lot of people that I never would have. Also, I've interviewed a few people from my family. And one guy, Pete Brown, the architect, he had done work for my father, who passed away 2 years ago. And I got to hear a story about my dad I didn't even know. That was fun. But I think the most enjoyable thing that I've discovered, I got to go back and tell you, when I first heard about Mark Maron, I didn't understand the guy at all. I watched a comedy special. I'm like, I don't get this. And then one of my favorite guitar players, Adrian Blue, is on his podcast. So I had to listen to that. And it really impressed me what Mark does. He often starts with a guest, and it's kind of uncomfortable, and you can tell the guest has a wall up. But always, and Mark is the best at this, halfway through they open up because they gain trust, and suddenly you go in this direction you never would have heard of. And I feel like I've gained the ability to do that now, and it's so exciting, especially when this drummer I interviewed yesterday, Donnie Wynn from Robert Palmer, Same thing. We never met each other. We were friends on Facebook, and wow, just he opened up this whole other world that we went into that we never would have been to. So me and the interviewee, we get to go to a place we've never been before.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Fantastic.
I have a question for you guys. I would love to hear from each of you what college you went to and what was a little spark back then that perhaps led to all of you being interested in makers.
Well, for me, I went to San Francisco State and I was in the design and industry department. So it was very clear to me. I knew already that I wanted to be in design and industry because I knew I wanted to go into the advertising agency business. So I needed to learn the craft of graphic design, production, photography, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very clear to me right from the beginning. And one of the projects that I really enjoyed was doing a slideshow on how to do a slideshow. We had a project where we had to do a slideshow. And I thought, well, what's the slideshow going to be about? Well, being the communicator, practical guy that I am, I decided to make the assignment that I would figure out how to do a slideshow. And then that would be my assignment, would be to tell other people how to do a slideshow. In other words, learn it by doing it. And I got to sort of make my own assignment. And I figured out how to use all the equipment and create a narrative in the correct order and transmit the information, accurately, make it entertaining, integrate visuals with audio, voiceover. It was training for me to do my first television commercial.
Yeah.
And that was a standout project for me because it perfectly represented everything that I wanted, which is I wanted to be creative with media, but as always, I wanted it to ultimately serve a purpose, which is, my perspective is different from that of a fine artist in that sense, in that I get the most excitement out of creating something that serves a practical purpose or has a functional value at the end.
Yes.
Not that I don't appreciate, obviously, art in its many forms, but the thing that turns me on the most is to make something functional and beautiful at the same time if I can.
Yeah.
For me, Parsons School of Design in New York City. When I was a kid, my dad drove a bus in Philadelphia. I had been making art. I learned, to draw with him, as we talked about. And one day he brought me home a poster. Looked a little bit like this. I'm holding it up, but it's a Robert Rauschenberg Earth Day poster. And it was all over the buses and subways of Philadelphia and New York, and I'm sure all around the world. And it was part of his commitment around Earth Day and to leave the world in a better place, a more sustainable place for present and future generations, if I paraphrase that. And that, among other things, oriented me to find my way into Parsons after the High School for Creative and Performing Arts, where, the teachers guided me there. And I needed to be practical because I couldn't afford Parsons. My parents couldn't afford Parsons. I got the scholarship and, so I focused on illustration because I was always kind of a fine artist undercover. But I wanted to be able to buy chicken and rice and beans. And I would say it was that kind of dual role of getting interested in typography and illustration and the practical side of things, presenting ideas together with sort of being a real student of fine artists and kind of following that path, gave me this kind of hybrid reality that speaks to this moment, I think, where people are putting new context to different creative parts of their lives,
right,
and beginning to piece things together and share stories and share what they've made. And, that for me is, I think, where it comes from.
Yeah.
I was in Scotland, living in Scotland in the 1980s when it was time to go to school. And I wanted to go to Napier University in Edinburgh. They had a photo degree. But I didn't get in there, ironically, because the interviewer didn't think I was passionate enough about photography, which anyone who knows me can see how ridiculous that is. So I got into a trade school called Stevenson College, where they had a little photo thing and you could learn how to fix mufflers and stuff like that. So I did 2 years there, but in those 2 years, I fell in love with the darkroom. And that's where the whole making thing started for me, was absolutely in the darkroom. And it remains that way to this day. Now it's a little more sophisticated. I still work in the darkroom a lot, but doing platinum prints and photogravures and more makery type stuff like
With
that.
With a fixer, right?
Yeah, fixer and acid and all kinds of yummy things. And ironically, a few years after I left, Stevenson was taken over by Napier University. So if you're unfortunate enough to be in the corporate world and you stumble across my resume, it says I went to Napier University, which is kind of true in a way. So anyway, that's my story.
Tom, you and I discovered parallel quotes yesterday. So what was the one by Steve Jobs about the bicycle?
Oh, well, that grew out of, and I'll just struggle to remember the full context of it, but he was talking about the evolution and various species on Earth and how much could be accomplished, I think just in terms of motion, like by calorie, how far you could go. And there are certain animals on Earth, creatures that are far more efficient with, calorie consumption. They can go much further than a human. But he then goes on to say, and this is really early Steve Jobs, right?
Yeah,
this is this is just out of the garage. That a human with a bicycle can go much further than any of those other animals, right? And this came around to the point he wanted to communicate is that he wanted us to think of the personal computer as a bicycle for the mind.
Yes. Yeah, and that led me to think of when Albert Einstein said, life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think one of the interesting things that I know we talk sometimes about stillness practice, meditation, and those, there's such a connection there to the creative process and to making things is that you find yourself in this flow zone and, it's this singularity of the moment of being in the present. And it's all too easy in a certain sense to be anchored to our stories.
Right.
From our past, and certainly, I know Rob, 15 years, and we've done stuff, and Rob knows Rory 30 years, and they've done stuff, and we've known each other for, through that video and through working on Rob's book. I was talking with him about the book you were talking about, but we hadn't met, but we had met.
Yeah.
But
our energies had met.
Yeah.
Without knowing it.
But it's always, I think, the present moment that gives us unlimited possibilities going forward, and that present moment is just as true for us as it is, for you and your listeners right now. What will you make?
Right.
Is the exciting question in this moment.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap this up. But before we go, let's tell the listeners how they can check out what you guys do. Please tell me if there are websites, emails, social media, links. Where's the best place to start?
Well, our website is Maker Compass Studio. We want to help orient makers to help them to connect with others and share their stories. We have an email address. We're all have this essentially the same email address: Rory at Maker Compass Studio, Tom at Maker Compass Studio, Rob at Maker Compass Studio. But I think the most important for us is my story at Maker Compass Studio, because that's what we're curious about. We want to know your story. We're on Instagram. We have a YouTube channel, which is Maker Compass Studio. And I think more and more, but we'll have those on. We're redesigning the website as we go. It's always evolving. And we'll certainly have, as projects take us to new places and open up new opportunities, there'll be more places to find us, I think. Farmers markets and trade fairs. And
you never know where you guys will pop up next.
Well, literally a pop-up. We've got that in the works.
All right, guys. Well, all three of you, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. I'd like to thank Tom Schreiber, Rob Keil, and Rory Earnshaw of Maker Compass Studios. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Thanks for having our little trio on. It's been a real pleasure.
Much appreciated.